Chapter 8. The relentless foghorn groaned through the night over the Sound, keeping me restless, trapped between the harsh reality and the savage, haunting dreams that gnawed at my sleep. As dawn threatened to break, the distant hum of a taxi climbing up Gatsby's drive jolted me from my bed. I dressed hurriedly, fueled by a pressing urge to warn him, to tell him something vital before it was too late. Crossing his lawn, the first light of day cast long shadows across the ground. Gatsby's front door hung open, revealing him inside, leaning against a hall table, the very picture of dejection, or perhaps the remnants of a night spent without sleep. "Nothing happened," he said in a faded voice as I approached. I waited, and around 4 o'clock she came to the window, stood there for a minute, and then the light went out. His mansion, normally so imposing, felt cavernous and eerie that night as we wandered through its vast rooms in search of cigarettes. We pushed through heavy curtains that fell like grand pavilions and fumbled along the walls for switches, the darkness around us so thick it felt like wading through a swamp. At one point, my foot caught on a piano, sending a ghostly clash of notes echoing off into the silence. Dust was everywhere, clinging to the air with a musty persistence, as if the house hadn't been opened for days. Finally, I located a humidor on an unfamiliar table. Inside were 2 stale cigarettes. We opened the French windows in the drawing room and sat, smoking into the dark void outside. "You should leave," I suggested, breaking the heavy silence. "They'll probably trace your car." "Go away now, old sport." His voice was tinged with disbelief. "Head to Atlantic City, or maybe up to Montreal for a week." He shook his head, stubbornly anchored by hope. "I can't leave Daisy, not until I know what she's going to do." He was clutching at some frail hope, and I hadn't the heart to shatter it. That was the night he spilled the story of his youth with Dan Cody, a tale he recounted because Jay Gatsby had shattered like glass against Tom's cruelty, and the extravagant masquerade of his life was over. Now, stripped of pretense, he could confess anything, but all he wanted to talk about was Daisy. She was the first nice girl he'd ever known. In his past, he'd brushed against the wealthy frequently enough, but always there was that unspoken barrier, like barbed wire, between them. He found her overwhelmingly desirable. He visited her mansion initially with other officers from Camp Taylor, then, later, alone. The house amazed him. It was more splendid than any he had ever entered. Yet what charged the air with magic was not the house itself, but that Daisy lived there. It seemed as incidental to her as his tent at camp was to him. The house hinted at a life both lush and vivid, with upstairs rooms more elegant than any others, and hints of joyous gatherings that resonated through the corridors, speaking of this year's shiny cars and barely faded dance flowers. It thrilled him that she had been loved by many men, enhancing her worth in his eyes. But his presence in Daisy's world was a colossal accident. Though his future as Jay Gatsby might be bright, at that moment he was just a penniless man without a past, a man whose uniform might at any moment slip from his shoulders, exposing him. So he seized what moments he could, taking what he wanted, ravenously, unscrupulously, until one quiet October night he took Daisy because he had no real claim to even touch her hand. He might have despised himself for the deception, for it wasn't his phantom millions he misrepresented, but rather he let her believe he was a man of her social tier, capable of ensuring her security. In truth, he was as vulnerable as any man to the whims of an impersonal government that could send him anywhere in the world. Yet he didn't despise himself, nor did things turn out as he had imagined. He intended to take from her and leave, but found himself irrevocably committed to pursuing a grail. Daisy was extraordinary, more so than he'd ever understood a nice girl could be. She vanished back into her rich, full life, leaving him feeling as though he were married to her. That was all. When they met again, 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless and betrayed. Her porch shone with the manufactured glow of starlight. The wicker of the settee squeaked under the weight of their reunion as he kissed her, her voice huskier from a cold, adding to her allure. In that moment, Gatsby was acutely aware of the divide wealth created, the ease it provided, and there was Daisy, gleaming like silver, insulated and untouchable above the struggles of the less fortunate. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering flames in the fireplace that cast a warm glow on Daisy's flushed cheeks. Outside, the cold breath of fall whispered against the windows, but inside, it was just Gatsby and Daisy, wrapped up in a moment so intense it seemed suspended outside of time. I can't even begin to explain how shocked I was when I realized I loved her, Gatsby confessed, his voice low, tinged with a mix of wonder and resignation. He was sprawled in an old armchair that had seen better days, Daisy nestled against him, her head on his shoulder. For a while, I hoped she'd end it, but she didn't. She loved me too. She thought I was wise because I knew things she didn't. Different things. His gaze drifted to the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. There I was, completely off the path I'd set for myself, falling deeper every minute. And suddenly, I didn't care about my grand plans anymore. What was the point of chasing great things if I was happier just dreaming out loud with her? That last afternoon before he left for Europe, they sat in silence, holding on to each other. Every now and then, she shifted slightly in his arms, and he'd adjust his hold, a soft kiss landing on her dark, glossy hair. The room around them was steeped in a tranquil silence, giving them a moment of profound connection, a memory to sustain them through the long separation that awaited. They had never been closer than they were in that month of love, never communicated more deeply than in those quiet exchanges, her lips brushing against the fabric of his coat, his fingertips gently touching hers as if she might be dreaming. In those silent gestures, in the soft rustle of the fire, in every shared breath, they spoke volumes. They filled the room with their quiet love, a poignant, unspoken dialogue that neither time nor distance could erase. Gatsby excelled during the war, swiftly rising to captain and eventually commanding the divisional machine guns after his heroics in the Argonne. When the armistice was declared, he was desperate to return home, but a mix-up sent him instead to Oxford. He fretted over this delay, his anxiety fueled by the increasingly desperate tone of Daisy's letters. She couldn't understand why he wasn't coming back. She felt the world pressing in on her, needing his presence to assure her she was still on the right path. Meanwhile, Daisy's world spun on, a whirl of orchids and elitist charm set to the rhythm of orchestras that played the latest tunes, a soundtrack of life's melancholy and allure. The saxophones wailed the Beale Street blues into the night, while a parade of golden and silver slippers shuffled across the dance floors, kicking up clouds of glittering dust. At the grey hour of afternoon teas, rooms pulsated with a low, sweet fever of conversation and laughter, fresh faces drifting through like rose petals caught in a breeze, all to the mournful accompaniment of distant horns. As the social season turned, Daisy was swept up once more in its flow. She filled her calendar with endless dates, flitting from man to man, only to find herself at dawn, slumped in a chair, the beads and chiffon of her gown tangled with wilted orchids on the floor beside her bed. Inside, she was screaming for resolution, for something or someone to shape her future immediately, be it through love, wealth, or sheer practicality. That resolution appeared in the spring with Tom Buchanan, a man of substantial bulk and even more substantial wealth. Daisy was taken with him. He was both a struggle and a relief from her indecision. Tom represented a decisive force, grounding her fluttering, drifting desires with the promise of stability. Gatsby received the news in a letter while still at Oxford, the words blurring before his eyes as he realized he was losing her to a world he had no part in. A world where decisions were made in the rhythm of dances he could not attend, in rooms he could not enter. The realization was as cold and grey as the tea hour, filled with the distant sad horns of his own regrets. The dawn was breaking over Long Island, painting the house with a light that turned from grey to gold. Outside, the shadow of a tree stretched sharply across the dew-soaked grass, and birds began their morning songs in the blue-tinted leaves. A gentle breeze promised a cool, serene day ahead. Gatsby turned away from the window, his face set with a challenging look. She never truly loved him, he declared, his voice thick with conviction. You have to remember, she was rattled yesterday. He spun his tales in a way that scared her, made me out to be some kind of con man. She got so twisted up, she barely knew what she was saying. He dropped into a chair, his mood darkening. Maybe there was a moment, right after they got married, when she felt something for him, and maybe even then, she loved me more. After a pause, he threw out a thought that seemed to hang heavier in the air. In any case, it was all just personal. That phrase hung between us, loaded with a depth that was hard to measure. He had come back from France right after Tom and Daisy's honeymoon, driven by a restless urge to be where she had been. Broke but unable to resist, he spent a week in Louisville on the last of his army pay, walking the streets they had once walked together, haunted by the ghost of their shared past. The city held a melancholic beauty now, tinged with the absence of her. Leaving Louisville, he felt a pang of regret, as if he was leaving part of himself behind with her. The day coach was stifling, but he moved to the open vestibule, watching the city recede into a sunset that seemed to bless it with a final benediction. He reached out, trying to grasp a fragment of the air she had breathed, a futile gesture as the train pulled him further from the place she had made sacred. It was 9 when we finished breakfast and stepped out onto the porch, the air crisp with a hint of autumn. Gatsby's last remaining servant approached. I'm going to drain the pool today, Mr. Gatsby. Leaves will start falling soon, and then we'll have trouble with the pipes. Not today, Gatsby responded, then turned to me with a hint of apology in his eyes. Believe it or not, I've never actually used that pool all summer. I checked my watch, feeling the pull of my train's departure. 12 minutes to my train. I had no real desire to head into the city. My work felt meaningless, trivial even, but it was more than that. I didn't want to leave Gatsby. I missed 2 trains before I could bring myself to leave. I'll call you up, I promised. Do, old sport. I'll call around noon. As we walked down the steps, he looked anxious. I suppose Daisy will call too. I suppose so. Goodbye then. We shook hands, and as I walked away, I turned back, driven by a sudden impulse. They're a rotten crowd, I shouted across the lawn. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. It was the truest thing I'd ever said to him, my first and last real compliment, because, despite everything, I never truly approved of him. First, he nodded, almost formally, and then his face lit up with that knowing smile, as if we'd always been on the same page. He stood out in his vivid pink suit against the white steps. I remembered the first night I arrived at his opulent home, the lawns swarming with those who whispered about his scandalous secrets while he maintained his elusive, hopeful dream. Goodbye, I called again. I enjoyed breakfast, Gatsby. The morning stretched out peaceful and promising as I left Gatsby there, a figure marked both by his dreams and the harsh daylight that now reclaimed him. In the city, I tried to focus on listing quotations for an endless array of stocks, but the monotony lulled me into a nap right there in my swivel chair. The sharp ring of the telephone yanked me from sleep, sweat beading on my forehead as I grabbed the receiver. It was Jordan Baker. She had a habit of calling around this time, given her unpredictable schedule bouncing between hotels, clubs, and private homes. Normally, Jordan's voice floated through the line fresh and vibrant, like a crisp breeze off the golf links. But today, her tone was harsh, brittle as dry leaves. "I've left Daisy's house," she stated flatly. "I'm in Hempstead now, heading down to Southampton this afternoon." Her departure from Daisy's was probably wise, but the news irked me, and her next words tensed me further. "You weren't so nice to me last night?" How had that mattered at the time? It seemed trivial now, yet it hung there between us. After a tense pause, she added, "However, I want to see you." "I want to see you too," I replied, a mixture of resignation and anticipation in my voice. "What if I skip Southampton and come into town this afternoon?" "I don't think this afternoon will work." "Very well. It's impossible today." "Various." Our conversation staggered on like this for a bit, then abruptly ended. I'm not sure who hung up with a sharp click, but it left a sour note, and I realized I didn't care much at the moment. The thought of trying to make polite conversation over a tea table that day seemed unimaginable. Moments later, I dialed Gatsby's house, only to find the line busy. I tried several more times without luck, each attempt leaving me more frustrated. Finally, an exasperated operator informed me the line was being held open for a long-distance call from Detroit. Pulling out my timetable, I circled the 3:50 train, a possible escape from the city's clutches. I leaned back, the chair creaking under the shift of weight, and tried to gather my thoughts. It was just noon, and the day was already feeling too long. The morning I passed the ash heaps on the train, I deliberately shifted to the opposite side of the car, trying to avoid the grim scene I knew would unfold. I imagined a curious crowd milling about all day, local kids scavenging for traces of the night's chaos, while some overly talkative bystander recounted the events until they blurred into fiction, with Myrtle Wilson's grim fate fading into a mere footnote. Now, I need to rewind to what transpired at the garage after we departed that previous evening. Finding Catherine, Myrtle's sister, proved difficult. She typically steered clear of booze, but that night she drowned her senses. When she finally showed up at the garage, she was so plastered she couldn't grasp that the ambulance had already rushed to Flushing. Upon realizing this, she fainted dead away, overwhelmed by the brutal reality. A good Samaritan, or perhaps just a nosy onlooker, scooped her up and followed the trail to her sister's body. The crowd outside the garage swelled and waned deep into the night. Inside, George Wilson was a broken man, oscillating between sobs and mumbled prayers on a dingy couch. The office door stayed open for a while, drawing the eyes of everyone who entered, until finally someone muttered about respect and closed it. Michaelis stayed by George's side, along with a rotating cast of locals. Eventually, it was just Michaelis holding down the fort, brewing coffee in the dead of night to keep himself awake. Around 3 in the morning, George's ramblings took a sharp turn. He grew quieter, fixated on the yellow car that had hit Myrtle. He then divulged that months earlier, Myrtle had come back from the city visibly battered, sparking a dormant rage in him. Hearing his own words, George recoiled, his grief erupting anew. Michaelis, clumsy in his attempts to console him, tried changing the subject. How long you been married, George? Michaelis asked, a feeble attempt to distract him. 12 years, George muttered, barely keeping still. Any kids ever come of it? George didn't answer, lost in his pain. Outside, cars sped past, each one a cruel reminder of the one that hadn't stopped. Michaelis, uneasy about entering the garage stained with tragedy, shuffled around the office, periodically sitting next to George, trying to offer some solace. Got a church you go to, George? Maybe they can help, huh? No church? George mumbled. Didn't you get married in a church, though? That was a long time ago, wasn't it? That's long past, George murmured, his voice hollow. He suddenly pointed to a desk drawer. Look in there, he instructed. Michaelis opened it to find a new, expensive dog leash, oddly out of place. This what you mean? George nodded, his eyes clouding over. Found it yesterday. She tried to explain it, but I knew it was something off. Michaelis, trying to be rational, offered explanations, but none took hold. George's mind was made up. Then he killed her, he concluded with a chilling finality. Who did, George? I'll find out, George insisted, his mind twisted tight with conspiracy. You're not thinking straight, George. It's just the grief talking. Michaelis tried to reason, but the dawn was breaking, and with it, any hold on normalcy slipped away. As the first light crept over the ash heaps, transforming them into a landscape of eerie shapes, George whispered again, I told her she couldn't fool God. I showed her, right there at the window. Told her God saw everything she did. Michaelis followed his gaze to the window, only to see the looming billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, its faded eyes staring back solemnly. That's just an ad, George, Michaelis pointed out gently. But George remained at the window, his face pressed against the glass, murmuring into the emerging day, God sees everything, as if those vacant eyes could penetrate the depths of human folly and sorrow lurking in the shadow of the ash heaps. By the time the sun crept up on Long Island, Michaelis was running on fumes, grateful when he heard a car pull up. It was a guy who had been around the night before, who'd promised to swing back by. Michaelis rustled up breakfast for them both, serving it as the early morning light began to fill the garage. Wilson had quieted down by then, his agitated murmurs from the night easing into a heavy silence. Once Michaelis had seen the man fed, he stumbled back to his place for a few hours of sleep. When he woke and rushed back to the garage, Wilson was gone. He'd hit the road on foot, his steps later traced to Port Roosevelt and then to Gads Hill, where he bought a sandwich he never ate and a coffee he barely touched. It was nearing noon by the time he got there, dragging his feet, a man clearly on the edge. The locals noticed. Some kids spotted him, looking unhinged, and a few drivers caught him staring like a ghost at the cars passing by. He vanished for a chunk of the afternoon, about 3 hours no one could account for. The cops figured he was hunting for the yellow car, maybe hitting up local garages with his wild-eyed story. But no garage owner came forward to say they'd seen him. Maybe he had a quicker way to get what he needed. By 2:30, Wilson was in West Egg, asking folks how to find Gatsby's place. He had a name now and a target. Meanwhile, Gatsby, clueless to the storm brewing just miles away, decided it was a fine hour for a swim. He slipped into his bathing suit, told the butler to hold all calls at the pool, and went out to fetch a pneumatic mattress from the garage, a relic from his summer parties. The chauffeur lent a hand with the pump. Don't take out the open car, Gatsby instructed, nodding towards the car with a banged-up fender. It was an odd request, given the damage. Hoisting the mattress on his shoulder, Gatsby headed for the pool, dismissing the chauffeur's offer to help with a shake of his head. He disappeared into the trees, a figure moving through the fading green. Back at the house, no calls came through. The butler, caught up in the routine, stayed by the phone till past 4 in the morning, long after anyone cared to call. Gatsby, alone by the pool, might have felt the weight of his dream unraveling, the fabric of his world coming loose. He looked up into an alien sky, felt the chill of the leaves, the harshness of the sun on new grass, and saw the world, his world, turning unfamiliar, a landscape where dreams floated like spectres. The shots broke the afternoon silence, sharp, sudden. The chauffeur, one of Wolfsheim's guys, heard them, but didn't make much of it then. It was only when I came charging up to the mansion, panic etched across my face, that the gravity of the situation hit. We, the chauffeur, the butler, the gardener, and I, all rushed to the pool. There the water barely whispered as it moved the mattress with Gatsby's body across the surface, disturbed only by a passing breeze and a touch of leaves. It wasn't until we were moving Gatsby back to the house that the gardener spotted Wilson's body in the grass nearby, marking the grim end of this whole tortured affair. Chapter 9. The day after Gatsby's death was a carousel of police activity, photographers snapping shots like it was a Hollywood crime scene, and reporters tripping over each other at the door. They roped off the main gate, a cop playing sentinel to keep the rubberneckers at bay. But the local kids, crafty as ever, found their way in through my yard, gawking at the pool. One detective, throwing around his weight in the term madman, set the tone for the morning papers. Those stories turned out more twisted than a back alley in Detroit, full of eager fabrications and sensational dread. Michaelis's deposition shed light on Wilson's suspicions, stirring up a media frenzy ready to feast on scandal. But Catherine, who could have turned the trial into a soap opera, kept mum. She faced down the coroner with steel in her gaze, insisting her sister had never known Gatsby, that Myrtle was happy with Wilson. No secrets, no lies. Her performance was so convincing she broke down right there, a picture of a grieved innocence. So the narrative simplified to paint Wilson as nothing more than a grieving husband pushed over the edge, not a premeditated avenger. That settled it for the public. As for me, I stood with Gatsby, isolated. As soon as I called the news into West Egg, I became the go-to for anything Gatsby. Every wild guess about him, every logistical query came my way. I reached out to Daisy right after finding Gatsby, acting on impulse. But she and Tom had cleared out early, no word on their return, no forwarding address. Left no address? I pressed the butler. No. Any idea where I could reach them? He had nothing. I needed to find someone for Gatsby, someone who really knew him. Maya Wolfsheim's name wasn't listed anywhere. The butler had an address, and I chased it down, but by then it was too late in the day. No one answered. Back in Gatsby's living room, overrun now by the authorities, it felt like these were just random faces passing through. They drew back the sheet covering Gatsby, and I felt him protesting through the fog of my exhaustion. "You've got to find someone for me." I broke away from a detective starting to pepper me with questions, went upstairs and rifled through Gatsby's desk for anything that might point to family, to someone who cared. Nothing but an old photo of Dan Cody. I sent a letter to Wolfsheim first thing next morning, asking for anything he could tell me, urging him to come. But his response was a hands-off, rattled excuse about not being able to get involved, wrapped up in important business. I felt a cold anger then, a defiant kinship with Gatsby against the whole damn world. That afternoon I got a call I thought was Daisy. Instead, it was a distant voice out of Chicago, someone named Slagle, talking fast about some mess with bonds. When I told him Gatsby was dead, the line went dead for a moment, then clicked off sharply. No Daisy, no Wolfsheim, just me and the memory of Gatsby against the creeping shadows of a world moving on too fast. The morning after Gatsby's tragedy, the chaos hadn't subsided. It seemed to swell with the rising sun. The front of Gatsby's lavish residence transformed into a stage set for a never-ending drama, with police weaving through photographers and reporters who filtered in and out like they owned the place. They roped off the main gate, but the local kids, curious and relentless, found a way through my yard, clustering around the pool, eyes wide and mouths agape. A detective, or someone who carried himself like he owned that kind of authority, muttered "madman" over Wilson's lifeless form. His voice cut through the murmur, setting a narrative that the morning papers would regurgitate with morbid enthusiasm. The stories were lurid, embellished fabrications of the night's grim events. Michaelis's testimony at the inquest shed some light on Wilson's torment over his wife's infidelity, but his sister Catherine, swayed by some newfound resolve, kept her lips sealed. Under the stern gaze of the coroner, she insisted her sister had been content and faithful, her declaration sealing her sister's reputation from scandalous rumors. The narrative simplified to paint Wilson as nothing more than a heartbroken soul, unhinged by grief, a convenient closure to a complex ordeal. For me, though, all that noise felt distant, irrelevant. I found myself standing alone on Gatsby's side of the line, the sole keeper of his narrative now that he was gone. After the news of his death had spread, every question about him came directed at me, a role I hadn't expected nor wanted. I'd called Daisy right after the tragedy, instinctively needing to connect, to inform. But she and Tom had vanished, fleeing with their secrets and their baggage, no forwarding address left behind. "No idea when they'll be back?" I pressed the butler who answered their phone. "No, sir." Frustration knotted my throat. "Where could they be?" "Couldn't say, sir." The urgency to find someone for Gatsby gnawed at me. I wanted to assure him, to bring someone who cared, but the reality was stark. He was alone. Maya Wolfsheim's information wasn't listed. The butler only had an office address. My calls to his office went unanswered, the void on the other line echoing the void that Gatsby had left behind. In the mansion, the influx of law enforcement and media didn't seem to acknowledge the man Gatsby had been. They only cared about the spectacle of his death. I found myself defending him, even as the reports spiraled into sensationalism. I sent a letter to Wolfsheim, imploring him to come, but his reply dashed any hope of support. "Dear Mr. Carraway, this is a terrible shock. I cannot get involved at this time due to important business commitments. Let me know later how I can assist. Yours, Maya Wolfsheim." The detachment in his words stung. As I hung up from another futile call, this time interrupted by news of some unrelated financial scandal, I felt a cold realization settle in. They had all abandoned him. Daisy, Wolfsheim, the fair-weather friends from his lavish parties. I was alone on his porch, the phone slipping a little in my sweaty grip as I tried to reconcile the image of the vibrant, hopeful Gatsby with the silent, sprawling estate around me. The world he had built, like his dreams, seemed to crumble by the minute, leaving nothing but echoes and the ghostly flutter of curtains in the empty rooms behind me. The morning after Gatsby's tragedy, the chaos hadn't subsided. It seemed to swell with the rising sun. The front of Gatsby's lavish residence transformed into a stage set for a never-ending drama, with police weaving through photographers and reporters who filtered in and out like they owned the place. They roped off the main gate, but the local kids, curious and relentless, found a way through my yard, clustering around the pool, eyes wide and mouths agape. A detective, or someone who carried himself like he owned that kind of authority, muttered "madman" over Wilson's lifeless form. His voice cut through the murmur, setting a narrative that the morning papers would regurgitate with morbid enthusiasm. The stories were lurid, embellished fabrications of the night's grim events. Michaelis's testimony at the inquest shed some light on Wilson's torment over his wife's infidelity, but his sister Catherine, swayed by some newfound resolve, kept her lips sealed. Under the stern gaze of the coroner, she insisted her sister had been content and faithful, her declaration sealing her sister's reputation from scandalous rumors. The narrative simplified to paint Wilson as nothing more than a heartbroken soul, unhinged by grief, a convenient closure to a complex ordeal. For me, though, all that noise felt distant, irrelevant. I found myself standing alone on Gatsby's side of the line, the sole keeper of his narrative now that he was gone. After the news of his death had spread, every question about him came directed at me, a role I hadn't expected nor wanted. I'd called Daisy right after the tragedy, instinctively needing to connect, to inform. But she and Tom had vanished, fleeing with their secrets and their baggage, no forwarding address left behind. "No idea when they'll be back?" I pressed the butler, who answered their phone. "No, sir." Frustration knotted my throat. "Where could they be?" "Couldn't say, sir." The urgency to find someone for Gatsby gnawed at me. I wanted to assure him, to bring someone who cared, but the reality was stark. He was alone. Maya Wolfsheim's information wasn't listed. The butler only had an office address. My calls to his office went unanswered, the void on the other line echoing the void that Gatsby had left behind. In the mansion, the influx of law enforcement and media didn't seem to acknowledge the man Gatsby had been. They only cared about the spectacle of his death. I found myself defending him, even as the reports spiraled into sensationalism. I sent a letter to Wolfsheim, imploring him to come, but his reply dashed any hope of support. "Dear Mr. Carraway, this is a terrible shock. I cannot get involved at this time due to important business commitments. Let me know later how I can assist. Yours, Maya Wolfsheim." The detachment in his words stung. As I hung up from another futile call, this time interrupted by news of some unrelated financial scandal, I felt a cold realization settle in. They had all abandoned him. Daisy, Wolfsheim, the fair-weather friends from his lavish parties. I was alone on his porch, the phone slipping a little in my sweaty grip as I tried to reconcile the image of the vibrant, hopeful Gatsby with the silent, sprawling estate around me. The world he had built, like his dreams, seemed to crumble by the minute, leaving nothing but echoes and the ghostly flutter of curtains in the empty rooms behind me. The morning after Gatsby's tragedy, the chaos hadn't subsided. It seemed to swell with the rising sun. The front of Gatsby's lavish residence transformed into a stage set for a never-ending drama, with police weaving through photographers and reporters who filtered in and out like they owned the place. They roped off the main gate, but the local kids, curious and relentless, found a way through my yard, clustering around the pool, eyes wide and mouths agape. A detective, or someone who carried himself like he owned that kind of authority, muttered, "Madman," over Wilson's lifeless form. His voice cut through the murmur, setting a narrative that the morning papers would regurgitate with morbid enthusiasm. The stories were lurid, embellished fabrications of the night's grim events. Michaelis's testimony at the inquest shed some light on Wilson's torment over his wife's infidelity, but his sister Catherine, swayed by some newfound resolve, kept her lips sealed. Under the stern gaze of the coroner, she insisted her sister had been content and faithful, her declaration sealing her sister's reputation from scandalous rumors. The narrative simplified to paint Wilson as nothing more than a heartbroken soul, unhinged by grief, a convenient closure to a complex ordeal. For me, though, all that noise felt distant, irrelevant. I found myself standing alone on Gatsby's side of the line, the sole keeper of his narrative now that he was gone. After the news of his death had spread, every question about him came directed at me, a role I hadn't expected nor wanted. I'd called Daisy right after the tragedy, instinctively needing to connect, to inform. But she and Tom had vanished, fleeing with their secrets and their baggage, no forwarding address left behind. No idea when they'll be back? I pressed the butler who answered their phone. No, sir. Frustration knotted my throat. Where could they be? Couldn't say, sir. The urgency to find someone for Gatsby gnawed at me. I wanted to assure him, to bring someone who cared, but the reality was stark. He was alone. Maya Wolfsheim's information wasn't listed. The butler only had an office address. My calls to his office went unanswered, the void on the other line echoing the void that Gatsby had left behind. In the mansion, the influx of law enforcement and media didn't seem to acknowledge the man Gatsby had been. They only cared about the spectacle of his death. I found myself defending him, even as the reports spiraled into sensationalism. I sent a letter to Wolfsheim, imploring him to come, but his reply dashed any hope of support. Dear Mr. Carraway, this is a terrible shock. I cannot get involved at this time due to important business commitments. Let me know later how I can assist. Yours, Maya Wolfsheim. The detachment in his words stung. As I hung up from another futile call, this time interrupted by news of some unrelated financial scandal, I felt a cold realization settle in. They had all abandoned him. Daisy, Wolfsheim, the fair-weather friends from his lavish parties. I was alone on his porch, the phone slipping a little in my sweaty grip as I tried to reconcile the image of the vibrant, hopeful Gatsby with the silent, sprawling estate around me. The world he had built, like his dreams, seemed to crumble by the minute, leaving nothing but echoes and the ghostly flutter of curtains in the empty rooms behind me. The morning after Gatsby's tragedy, the chaos hadn't subsided. It seemed to swell with the rising sun. The front of Gatsby's lavish residence transformed into a stage set for a never-ending drama, with police weaving through photographers and reporters who filtered in and out like they owned the place. They roped off the main gate, but the local kids, curious and relentless, found a way through my yard, clustering around the pool, eyes wide and mouths agape. A detective or someone who carried himself like he owned that kind of authority muttered, "Madman," over Wilson's lifeless form. His voice cut through the murmur, setting a narrative that the morning papers would regurgitate with morbid enthusiasm. The stories were lurid, embellished fabrications of the night's grim events. Michaelis's testimony at the inquest shed some light on Wilson's torment over his wife's infidelity, but his sister Catherine, swayed by some newfound resolve, kept her lips sealed. Under the stern gaze of the coroner, she insisted her sister had been content and faithful, her declaration sealing her sister's reputation from scandalous rumors. The narrative simplified to paint Wilson as nothing more than a heartbroken soul, unhinged by grief, a convenient closure to a complex ordeal. For me, though, all that noise felt distant, irrelevant. I found myself standing alone on Gatsby's side of the line, the sole keeper of his narrative now that he was gone. After the news of his death had spread, every question about him came directed at me, a role I hadn't expected nor wanted. I'd called Daisy right after the tragedy, instinctively needing to connect, to inform. But she and Tom had vanished, fleeing with their secrets and their baggage, no forwarding address left behind. No idea when they'll be back? I pressed the butler who answered their phone. No, sir. Frustration knotted my throat. Where could they be? Couldn't say, sir. The urgency to find someone for Gatsby gnawed at me. I wanted to assure him, to bring someone who cared, But the reality was stark. He was alone. Maya Wolfsheim's information wasn't listed. The butler only had an office address. My calls to his office went unanswered, the void on the other line echoing the void that Gatsby had left behind. In the mansion, the influx of law enforcement and media didn't seem to acknowledge the man Gatsby had been. They only cared about the spectacle of his death. I found myself defending him, even as the reports spiraled into sensationalism. I sent a letter to Wolfsheim, imploring him to come, but his reply dashed any hope of support. Dear Mr. Carraway, this is a terrible shock. I cannot get involved at this time due to important business commitments. Let me know later how I can assist. Yours, Maya Wolfsheim. The detachment in his words stung. As I hung up from another futile call, this time interrupted by news of some unrelated financial scandal, I felt a cold realization settle in. They had all abandoned him. Daisy, Wolfsheim, the fair-weather friends from his lavish parties. I was alone on his porch, the phone slipping a little in my sweaty grip as I tried to reconcile the image of the vibrant, hopeful Gatsby with the silent, sprawling estate around me. The world he had built, like his dreams, seemed to crumble by the minute, leaving nothing but echoes and the ghostly flutter of curtains in the empty rooms behind me. It was on the third day after Gatsby's death that a telegram arrived, scrawled with the name Henry C. Gatz from a small town in Minnesota. The message was brief, requesting a delay of the funeral until his arrival. He was Gatsby's father. When Mr. Gatz showed up at the mansion, he was a picture of old age wrapped in an oversized, cheap ulster that looked out of place in the warmth of the September day. His eyes, red and watery with the strain of grief and travel, barely held back tears as I helped him with his belongings. The old man's hands were shaky, fumbling at his sparse grey beard so incessantly that it was a struggle just to help him out of his coat. I saw it in a Chicago paper, he murmured, his voice trembling. I came as soon as I could. I led him into the less formal music room, hoping to make him comfortable. Despite offering him something to eat and a glass of milk, which his trembling hands couldn't hold steady, he refused. I'm all right now, he insisted, but his eyes wandered helplessly around the room. He was mad to do it, he muttered more to himself than to me, a way to make sense of the senseless. Had to be mad. Ignoring his refusal, I pressed him again for coffee, but he shook his head, distracted and distant. Where is Jimmy now? I guided him into the drawing room where Gatsby lay. Mr. Gatz paused at the doorway, taking in the grandeur of the hall with a mix of sorrow and awe, his grief momentarily laced with pride. After settling him in a guest bedroom, his exhaustion was evident as he lay down fully clothed, immediately falling into a fitful sleep. That night, I received a call from someone claiming to be Klipspringer. But instead of expressing condolences or inquiring about the funeral, he seemed more concerned with retrieving a pair of tennis shoes he had left at the house. The funeral's tomorrow at 3, I told him, trying to draw him back to the reason for my call. He hesitated, making excuses about other commitments. The call ended abruptly after I pressed for a definite answer, his lack of commitment hanging awkwardly between us. The next morning, as I tried to arrange for some company for Gatsby from his past, reaching out to Maya Wolfsheim was my last hope. The office, under the guise of the Swastika Holding Company, was as elusive as the man himself. When I finally confronted him after a tense exchange with his secretary, he refused to attend the funeral, citing business and an aversion to getting involved with deaths. Wolfsheim reminisced briefly about Gatsby's difficult start and his rise, painting a picture of a man who had clawed his way out from nothing, attributing much of his success to his own influence. Yet, when it came down to saying a final goodbye, he remained detached, justifying his absence with hollow platitudes about friendship and loyalty in life rather than death. Leaving the city under a drizzling sky, I returned to West Egg and found Mr. Gatz pacing the hall of his son's mansion. He clung to a photograph of Gatsby's house, a tangible memory of his son's achievements. He showed it to me with trembling pride, pointing out each detail as if each held a piece of his son's essence. "Jimmy was always bound to do great things," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled out a tattered copy of Hopalong Cassidy, a relic from Gatsby's childhood. Even as a boy, he dreamed big. That evening, as the reality of his son's lonely, tragic end set in, the grandeur of the mansion seemed to mock the solemnity of the gathering. Mr. Gatz stood by the massive windows, looking out at the estate as if trying to understand the price of dreams made and lost. The old book creaked as he opened it to the last page, turning it around for me to see. There, in neat, faded handwriting under the heading Schedule, were the commitments of a rigorous, regimented life. Rise from bed, 6 a.m. Dumbbell exercise and wall scaling, 6:15 to 6:30 a.m. Study electricity, etc., 7:15 to 8:15 a.m. Work, 8:30 to 4:30 p.m. Baseball and sports, 4:30 to 5 p.m. Practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it, 5 o'clock to 6 p.m. Study needed inventions, 7 o'clock to 9 p.m. Below, in a section labeled General Resolves, the aspirations were even more personal. No wasting time at shafters or illegible. Quit smoking and chewing. Bathe every other day. Read one improving book or magazine per week. Save $3 per week. Be better to parents. "I stumbled upon this by accident," the old man said, his voice thick with reverence and a hint of sadness. "Shows you the kind of man he was aiming to be, doesn't it?" "It certainly does. He was always pushing himself to improve, always planning. See this here about not wasting time and improving his mind? That was just like him. He even once told me I ate like a hog, and I beat him for it." He chuckled, a soft, sorrowful sound. He seemed reluctant to shut the book, running his fingers over the words as if he could absorb the young ambition that once vibrated through his son. The room grew quiet, the air thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts and the tick of the grandfather clock. As we neared 3 o'clock, the Lutheran minister from Flushing arrived, his presence a stark reminder of why we were gathered. Both the old man and I found ourselves peering out the windows, hoping for the arrival of more guests. But the streets remained empty, save for a stray leaf or two that danced in the gentle wind. Inside, the servants lined up by the hall, their expressions somber, their postures stiff. Mr. Gatz's eyes flickered with anxiety, and he occasionally muttered about the possibility of rain, though the day was clear. The minister, aware of the time, checked his watch frequently. Sensing his restlessness, I pulled him aside. "Could we possibly wait another half-hour?" I whispered, hoping for a miracle. He nodded, though his glance towards the door remained hopeful, yet doubtful. As the minutes dragged on, the reality settled heavy in the room. No one else was coming. The promise of a dignified gathering faded, leaving the echo of a dream that was once so vibrant, now just a whisper among the few of us who cared to remember. The drizzle had thickened into a steady pour by the time our 3-car procession pulled up at the cemetery gates around 5 o'clock. Leading was the hearse, a looming spectre of black against the grey afternoon, followed by the limousine carrying Mr. Gatz, the minister, and me. Bringing up the rear, Gatsby's own station wagon ferried 4 or 5 of his servants and the local postman, all soaked through as if they'd swum there from West Egg. As we passed through the gates, the somber crunch of gravel beneath our feet, I caught the sound of another car pulling up hastily, A man emerged, chasing after us across the wet grass with heavy, splashing steps. Turning, I recognized him, the man with the owl-eyed glasses from that night at Gatsby's, poring over his library with wonder. I hadn't seen him since that party, and how he'd learned of the funeral or his name remained a mystery to me. Water streamed down his face, fogging his thick glasses. He paused to remove them, wiping the lenses with a soaked handkerchief before squinting at the canopy being drawn over Gatsby's final resting place. At that moment, I tried to summon a solid memory of Gatsby, but he seemed already a figure receding into myth, obscured more by each passing second and the indifferent drizzle that Daisy, conspicuously absent, did not disrupt with so much as a telegram or a flower. From somewhere nearby, a voice intoned, "Blessed are the dead that the rain falls on." The owl-eyed man echoed the sentiment, his voice robust despite the grim setting. Amen to that. As the brief ceremony concluded, and we made our way back to the cars, the man caught up to me at the gate. "I couldn't get to the house," he said, a hint of disbelief in his tone, as if the fortress of Gatsby's lavish parties had been a beacon now inexplicably extinguished. "Neither could anybody else," I returned, the reality settling heavy. He looked startled, then reflective. Why, my God, they used to go there by the hundreds. His hands worked again at his glasses, this time cleaning them inside and out with a more deliberate motion. He sighed, the glasses back in place, his gaze lingering on the grave as he muttered, almost to himself, "The poor son of a bitch." His words, stark and devoid of the pretense often heard in the murmurs of the wealthy, hung between us, a simple epitaph for a man who dreamed too recklessly. We were bundled up, stepping out of the old Union Station into the icy December air, our breath fogged in bursts as laughter and quick exchanges filled the frigid evening. A handful of Chicago friends, already swept up in holiday revelries, shouted quick goodbyes amid the chaos. I could still hear the girls in their fur coats gossiping about holiday plans. "Are you going to the Ordways? The Herseys? The Schultzes?" Our hands, sheathed in leather gloves, clung to the long green tickets that promised a ride through the heartland. As our train, decked in the cheerful hues of the Chicago, Milwaukee and St. Paul Railroad awaited us, I felt the pull of nostalgia. We left behind the city lights for the snow-covered fields of Wisconsin, the real snow that belonged to us, twinkling against the train windows. The lights of small-town stations blurred past, their dim glow a brief halo in the night. A brisk, wild wind swept through the open vestibules as we returned from dinner, a reminder of our deep, undeniable ties to this land, however fleeting our visit might be. This was my Middle West, not the endless fields or the lost towns, but the lively homecomings of my youth, sleigh bells in the dark, and the soft glow of holiday lights against the fresh snow. I was molded by those long winters, shaped by the legacy of the Caraway name, which lingered on our home like a badge of honor. Even as the East lured me with its promises of grandeur, it was always slightly askew, like a dream too vivid to be real. After Gatsby's death, that dream twisted into something unrecognizable. The East haunted me, its landscapes morphed into nightmarish visions that El Greco might have painted, a scene surreal and slightly grotesque, where revelry turned to madness under a sullen sky. When autumn returned, and the air tasted of smoke and drying leaves, I knew it was time to leave. The East had lost its allure, faded into a backdrop for a chapter of my life that was closing. Before I left, I had to see Jordan Baker. It was an awkward, necessary farewell, tied up in loose ends and unspoken truths. She sat, poised and ready for a game of golf, looking every bit the part of an autumnal goddess, her demeanor cool and detached. As I recounted the events that had unfolded, she listened, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she dropped the bombshell of her engagement as casually as one might mention the weather. I feigned surprise, though doubt nagged at me. Our goodbye was tinged with a cocktail of emotions, resentment, affection, and a profound sense of loss. "You threw me over on the phone," she said abruptly, a flicker of something like betrayal crossing her features. It was a new experience for me. We shook hands, and just as I turned to leave, she brought up our old conversation about bad drivers. "I met another bad driver, didn't I?" I paused, caught off guard. "I thought you were honest, straightforward. I thought that was your secret pride." "I'm 30, I admitted, feeling the weight of the years, too old to lie to myself and call it honor." She said nothing, and with a heavy heart, I walked away, the unresolved tension hanging between us like the cold December air. One late October afternoon, I spotted Tom Buchanan striding down Fifth Avenue. His gait was sharp, hands poised like a boxer ready to fend off the city's chaos. His head darted around, eyes restless, taking in everything and nothing all at once. Just as I slowed to avoid catching up, he halted, peering into a jewelry store window with a deep frown. Suddenly, he saw me and marched back, extending his hand. "What's the matter, Nick? You got a problem shaking hands with me?" "Yeah, I do. You know what I think of you." "You're crazy, Nick," he snapped, his voice quick and edgy. "Crazy as hell. I don't know what your problem is." "Tom," I pressed, "what did you say to Wilson that afternoon?" He stared at me, silent, and I knew I'd hit the mark about those missing hours. I turned to walk away, but he stepped forward and grabbed my arm. "I told him the truth," he said, eyes fierce. "He showed up while we were packing to leave. When I sent word down that we weren't in, he tried to force his way upstairs. He was mad enough to kill me if I hadn't told him who owned the car. His hand was on a revolver in his pocket the whole time he was there." He paused, then continued defiantly. "What if I did tell him? That guy had it coming. He threw dust in your eyes just like he did Daisy's. He ran over Myrtle like she was a stray dog and didn't even stop." There was nothing I could say, except for the one truth that couldn't be spoken. "And if you think I didn't suffer," he added, his voice breaking, "when I went to close up that flat and saw that damn box of dog biscuits sitting there on the sideboard, I sat down and cried like a baby. By God, it was awful." I couldn't forgive him or even like him, but I saw that in his twisted mind he believed he was justified. It was all so carelessly tangled. Tom and Daisy were careless people. They smashed things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast indifference, letting others clean up the mess they left behind. I shook his hand. It felt pointless not to, as if I was speaking to a child. Then he turned and went into the jewelry store, probably to buy a pearl necklace or maybe just a pair of cuff buttons, rid of my provincial squeamishness forever. Gatsby's mansion stood desolate as I departed, its once lush lawn now a wild tangle mirroring the neglect of my own. There was this cabbie in town, a regular gossip who'd pause by the entrance gate, pointing and gesturing as if he owned the place. Perhaps he had ferried Daisy and Gatsby to East Egg on the fateful night of the accident, weaving his own tale from the strands of rumor. I wanted no part of it, and steered clear of him as I disembarked from the train. My Saturdays found me in New York, haunted by memories of those shimmering, opulent parties, the music and laughter still echoing faintly in my mind. One evening, the distant hum of a car reached me, its headlights illuminating Gatsby's front steps. But I paid it no mind, likely just a latecomer, unaware that the revelry had long ended. On my final night, with my bags packed and my car sold off, I ventured over for one last look at that colossal, chaotic mansion. A vulgar epithet scrawled on the white steps caught my eye: etched by some mischievous youth. I rubbed it out with my shoe, the stone protesting with a rasping sound. Then I ambled down to the beach, sinking into the sand. The grand coastal retreats were shuttered now, their lights extinguished, save for the faint glow of a ferryboat traversing the sound. As the moon ascended, the lesser abodes faded, revealing the ancient island that once beckoned Dutch sailors, a verdant sanctuary of the New World. The vanished trees, displaced by Gatsby's ambition, had once whispered to mankind's loftiest dreams. In that fleeting, enchanted moment, humanity must have held its breath, confronted by a beauty beyond comprehension. Lost in reverie, I pondered the wonder that had driven Gatsby to fixate on the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had traversed vast distances to this azure expanse, his dreams seemingly within grasp. Unbeknownst to him, they had slipped into the shadowy abyss beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic stretched endlessly into the night. Gatsby clung to the green light, the elusive promise of a future forever beyond reach. Though it slipped through our fingers then, it mattered not. Tomorrow, we would sprint faster, reach farther, and one fine morning. So we pressed on, like boats battling the relentless current, perpetually drawn back into the depths of the past.